I'm Joe Lample. When I created Growing a Greener World, I had one goal: to tell stories of everyday people, innovators, entrepreneurs, forward-thinking leaders, who are all, in ways both big and small, dedicated to organic gardening and farming, lightening our footprint, conserving vital resources, protecting natural habitats, making a tangible difference for us all. They're real, they're passionate, they're all around us. They're the game changers who are literally growing a greener world and inspiring the rest of us to do the same. Growing a Greener World, it's more than a movement, it's our mission. The best gardens have a real sense of place about them. Now sure, you could take Midwestern prairie grasses and grow them in the Deep South, or you could take a palm tree and plant it in Minnesota, or take a desert cactus and make it the focal point of your Cape Cod landscape, at least in the summertime. But the best gardens are the ones that tell you, simply by the plants that fill the space, exactly where you are in the world. And if ever there were a place, one place, that can show you the true beauty of native plants in their natural surroundings, and then inspire you to be conservators of the natural habitat and inform you about all the benefits of native plants, it's here, Mount Cuba Center, located just 40 miles southwest of downtown Philadelphia. With 1,100 acres nearly and a focus on native plants under their care, Mount Cuba Center truly is a place for conservation, education, scientific research, and most of all, inspiration. Some come to Mount Cuba Center simply to take a stroll through the beautiful and historic gardens. Some take part in continuing education classes with gardening topics like pruning trees, propagating plants, and integrated pest management. Conservation topics like learning about pollinators and designing mini ecosystems. Arts and crafts sessions like botanical drawing, making paper, and creating leaf castings. Or wellness classes that include nature walks, yoga, and Tai Chi. There's even a 12-week summer internship program and fellowship opportunities for field research. It's a dizzying array of outreach programs, all designed to attract thousands of visitors each year to this northernmost corner of the state of Delaware. But it all started in the 1930s as the private residential garden of one of the country's most well-known families.
So at its origins, Mount Cuba Center was the home of the Copeland family. Mr. Lamont DuPont Copeland was a scion of the DuPont family, industrialists, innovators, and among the wealthiest people in America during the early 20th century. And he and his wife Pamela Copeland moved to this area that then was really in the countryside outside of Wilmington to set up their new home and soon thereafter their gardens. They developed formal gardens around the house, and then as they acquired more property, began to expand down the hillside. But along the way, a couple things happened. One is Mrs. Copeland's passion for native plants began to influence the evolution of the gardens more and more. Mrs. Copeland grew up in Litchfield, Connecticut, and as I understand it, spent hours during her childhood walking in the woods and the fields and getting to know the native wildflowers there. And when she came down to this area, it was a time of increasing development throughout the United States, and she became concerned about people damaging the environment and despoiling these wonderful natural resources that we had. And so she wanted people to connect with nature more closely and to appreciate how special our native flora is.
That hope for people to connect with nature more closely led to the second thing that happened. The Copelands decided to share their gardens with the public. Shortly after Mrs. Copeland's passing in 2001, their dream was fully realized with the opening of the estate grounds at Mount Cuba Center. Jeff Downing is now the executive director.
Mrs. Copeland gave us what has become the vision statement of the organization. We called it our founding intention. She said, I want this to be a place where people will learn, to appreciate our native plants and to see how these plants can enrich their lives so that they, in turn, will become conservators of our natural habitats. And that's a really important thing because the Copelands didn't just want this to be a pretty place to go. They had a very specific intention that Mount Cuba be a place where we inspire people, the community, to then go home and consider thinking differently about their own landscape practices so that they might garden more in harmony with nature's systems. That's a tricky thing to do, but it's something we're committed to trying to do. So at every step of the way, we try to analytically assess if we're following through on inspiration, if we're following through on motivating people to go home and actually take action, and if all of that running around actually adds up to something measurable, valuable to the environment.
That's a tall order for any garden to achieve, even one that's 1,100 acres. It's up to Director of Horticulture Travis Beck to bring Pamela Copeland's vision to life for a new generation of gardeners. So walking down these paths, are these the ones Mrs. Copeland would have actually put in place as we see them, or did you guys do this after the fact?
This is really Mrs. Copeland's original work carried out, and we've just preserved it. She was involved in laying out the rocks for this wall here, and in, I'm sure, selecting the locations for these trees, which have matured wonderfully in the intervening years.
It's really kind of neat to put yourself in her position and imagine that you're her walking down her garden.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of the experience we want our visitors to have, is that this is still an intimate place where you get that up-close experience of native plants.
Right. Native plants are exactly what the name says, plant life that's naturally indigenous to a specific region over sometimes thousands of years or more. But they're also the plants that are sometimes misunderstood or misinterpreted, and they're the ones that we think are weedy or boring, and they get dug up or ripped out to make room for the plants that we want to see growing there. But gardeners often talk about the right plant for the right place. But with native plants and their natural disease resistance and longevity and hardiness, well, that's Mother Nature's perfect example of what she says is the right plant for the right place. But thankfully, natives are making a comeback with home gardeners in places like Mount Cuba Center, who are recognizing the value of native plants in the home landscape and for growing a greener world.
Well, native plants, in the simplest terms, are the plants that belong in any environment. They're the plants that evolved with the climate and the geology of any area. So when we use native plants, we get all the advantages of that adaptation. We also get plants that create a sense of place and make us feel like our home landscape that we're designing and manages fits into the larger natural environment and connects to it in some way. And those connections aren't merely symbolic, but they're very real for the bees, the butterflies, the birds that all use the natural environments and the built landscape for their habitat. Native plants are the foundation of the food web. They feed the insects that feed the birds and other organisms, and we need them in order to have a healthy ecosystem. Native plants connect us to the deep history of this place. They show us what was here before, and they show us what wants to be here in a very real way. We have a wonderful video of Mrs. Copeland touring the gardens with Dick Leidy, who is the former director here. And as they walk along the dogwood path next to the moss bank, he prompts her to reflect on how it was that they created that area, noting that it was one of the more difficult places in the garden to figure out what to get to grow there. And she said, because it was difficult, we took our time, we waited to see what would come in here on its own, and then that gave us the cues we needed to add, to edit, to let it evolve, based on really what wanted to grow in those conditions. And that's really what Mount Cuba is telling us all that we should be doing in our gardening, to observe how nature operates, to take our time to make decisions, and to cooperate with the natural processes of our environment.
Travis, what are the arguments that you most often hear for people that aren't really keen on using native plants in the landscape?
I continue to hear people say that native plants are messy, to which I say, look at our gardens. You can lay out a beautiful planting design with native plants, mass them, repeat the colors, have contrasting foliage, throw in a little structure with your trees and shrubs, add a specimen, and boom, you've got a beautiful garden. Sure, it's loose, sure, it's naturalistic, but it's not messy.
Right. Travis, as we walk these paths, I am so taken aback by the masses of trillium here. You really don't see that anywhere else. What's up with that?
You don't anymore. With the forest being fragmented and the explosion in our deer population, these plants are really hard to find in the wild.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so important that we have them here, both to conserve them and also to show them to the public so they can understand what should be there and what could be there.
And it's a great opportunity for them to plant more to really kind of replicate this in the home garden.
Absolutely. And trillium is not a beginner plant, but if you can pull it off, then you know you're initiated in the world of native plant gardening.
What a great surprise in spring, though, as you're walking along and you see those trillium coming up from the ground in your forest floor of your own yard.
It's the most wonderful feeling.
Yeah, I love that. To the novice, it may look lazy to just let Mother Nature do whatever she wants and call it native. Well, it's not quite that hands-off, and Travis and his staff at Mount Cuba are very skilled in a process they call editing, fine-tuning what grows naturally to create a show-stopping display. And while Mount Cuba employs more gardeners per acre than most public gardens do, taking a deliberately native approach to your landscape will typically lower your overall maintenance and cut way down on the least enjoyable part of yard work.
When the leaves fall from the trees, we let them stay on the ground, underneath those trees where they break down. One of my favorite things about working at Mount Cuba is that when you find a stick on the path, you just take it, break it up, and throw it back in the bed. And that stick is going to decompose and contribute to the litter on the forest floor. When a tree dies here, we might not take it all the way down to the ground. We might leave a snag, and that snag becomes home for woodpeckers, for squirrels that play their own role in this garden. And when we do have to take a plant down to the ground, a large tree, we usually don't take out the stump. We leave that stump to decompose in place. And that becomes, again, its own little niche environment for a different set of fungi, insects, and other animals. And by having this diversity of woody debris from the large to the small and the leaves on the forest floor, we're mimicking a natural forest environment, and that's the habitat in which most of our native forest floor plants grow, and they're happier here and healthier for that. Anyone can do what we do here at Mount Cuba. You have to get to know the place that you live and care for, understand the conditions that are there, take your time to try things out, see what succeeds, see what fails, take inspiration from natural habitats that you may visit, and from gardens like these. And if you can do all of that and put it together, you too can work with the natural processes of your area and have a successful garden that doesn't care for itself, but that is a lot of fun to care for.
As I look into this bed, that's a clear example of how you encourage dense planting to sort of shade out those weeds, right?
It absolutely is. In this bed we have a variety of spreading plants like the blue woodland phlox here, and self-sowing plants like the red columbines, and these just fill in the entire space. In fact, just earlier this week we had our gardeners and a group of volunteers in editing out some of the woodland sedum that you see there.
Which is a good plant, except when it's out of place, then it's technically a weed, right?
That's right. Luckily, the volunteers got to take some pieces home.
That's a good one. Now that's a weed I'd be happy to take home.
Our gardens at Mount Cuba really show you how you can create a three-dimensional landscape. It's not about turf and trees, it's not about mulch and flowers, it's about having turf and trees and mulch and flowers and shrubs and bees and slugs and everything growing together on top of one another with each other. And in a way, that's the most fun part of gardening. You're not weeding, you're not watering, you're going through and saying, hey, this plant was more successful than I thought. it's spread, it's taking over. I'm going to take some of it out of this area. Maybe I'll move it over here, maybe I'll give it to my friends, maybe I'll just compost it. Or here's a spot that needs something. What is nearby that seems to be working that I can bring in? And that's very much how our gardens have developed over time, through generations of gardeners observing what's working and making those small changes day after day.
Some of those small changes might include different plant varieties. And yes, even in the world of natives, there can be dozens of varieties of the same plant. Part of the extensive study going on at Mount Cuba includes learning as much as possible about plants that many people, even experienced, lifelong gardeners, sometimes take for granted. George Coombs is the manager of horticulture research. So George, we're standing in your domain. These are the trial gardens here. Tell me about the purpose of this. What are we doing here?
Really, I kind of like to tell people that this is like consumer reports for plants, trying to make recommendations for gardeners so that they'll be successful when they plant these things at their house.
And of course, these are native plant varieties. You're trialing these over what, a 3-year period?
3 years usually. We're looking to see how they perform over the long term, you know, multiple seasons, multiple kind of weather variations and that sort of thing.
Right. So on average, how many plants or varieties or cultivars of the typical plant are you doing?
It really just depends on the group. Right now we're standing in our coneflower trial. We've got over 80 different kinds of coneflowers, so that's kind of one of our larger ones. Amsonia, for example, we only have about 20, so it just really depends.
Okay. Now you're not the only public garden or university or institution doing plant trials, but you are one of the only ones or the only one looking at certain things on those plants in addition to overall performance.
Yeah, being focused on native plants, we're really interested in the ecological value that they provide. And so one of the things that we've been doing over the past few years is monitoring pollinator visits and seeing if there are certain cultivars or certain species that are getting more pollinator activity than others. So that way, if you're looking to build a pollinator garden, you know, we can kind of point you to the right direction.
And so from an ecological standpoint, you're also looking for drought tolerance and overall performance, disease resistance, things like that?
Yep. How long they bloom, you know, their sturdiness of their habit, all the things that gardeners care about, just kind of tacking on that ecological component.
And then how do you get the word out on that?
We create these reports that really kind of summarize the top performers for each trial. We also kind of put even more in-depth information onto our website. So gardeners can kind of read about what performs best, get to learn how to, you know, some gardening tips with each plant. And kind of if you want to deep dive into a particular cultivar, you can kind of dial into our website further.
Well, George, this is a nice trial, the Amsonia trial, the only one in bloom at the moment. So for visitors, I'm sure they like to see this one. Tell me more about what's going on here.
Yeah, we've got about 20 different kinds of Amsonia, and we're really just kind of looking to explore which species do what and kind of evaluate their overall performance. This trial is actually in its 4th year, so we're looking to see which species you know, really kind of do the best here.
So you said 4th year, right?
I did, which is a little different than what we normally do, but these plants are slower to mature, so we really have to kind of give them the extra time.
Okay, so in 4 years, have you found any major ahas on these?
Actually, we have. There's a cultivar that's commonly promoted as a great native plant called Amsonia blue ice, which we found is not really a native. We've been growing it kind of next to Amsonia orientalis, which is native to Turkey. And they're basically the same plant. They bloom at the same time, have the same growth habit, get the same disease in the summertime, which nobody else gets. So there's really no reason to think that they're anything different.
So even though it has a lot of great value on its own merit, it's nice to also know for those real native plant enthusiasts that it's technically not a native to
Correct.
this area.
Yep. Yeah.
But for all the splendor that Mount Cuba puts on display, and for all the education they do about native plants, I wondered if the concept was really taking off in the real world. Just down the road from Mount Cuba, at Gateway Garden Center, owner Peg Castorani believes the native movement is real and growing. You've been here 35 years, right? So you've seen a lot of transition from how it used to be to how it is now and where it's going. Tell me a little bit about the evolution that you've noticed recently as it relates to native plants.
Well, people come in with a knowledge of native plants already. So we're in a very horticulturally hot spot here. So we're very fortunate that our customers are very well educated.
So being so close to Mount Cuba, clearly has a little bit of an advantage for you because as we just heard, some of your customers are showing up here after being inspired from what they see at Mount Cuba, and you create a great opportunity for them to pick up plants here. So that has to help. But you're telling me that a lot of your customers, or a good percentage of them, are coming in on their own just asking for natives, whether they've been to Mount Cuba or not. That's kind of a turning point, finally.
Absolutely. I don't know how it happens, but there's that flip moment where it finally reaches sort of a mainstream culture for gardeners,
Yeah.
and we're thrilled.
As backwards as it may sound, plants that are native to a geographic region are sometimes the hardest to find locally. Big box stores, for example, sell lots of different plant varieties, but very few are native, or at least not labeled as such. So where do you go if you want to add some native plants to your landscape or garden? Well, you've heard me beat this drum many times before, but I'm doing it once again, and that's your neighborhood independent garden center. Not only do they have lots of native varieties, but they're staffed with plenty of people who are passionate about natives too. Plus, by a simple conversation, a lot of times they'll carry those varieties that you're looking for. So while the megastores may be a great go-to source for a lot of things, when it comes to gardening with natives, well, that takes a different mindset, which usually requires a nursery that's willing to think differently about their plants that they carry too. At Mount Cuba, encouraging that different mindset about the plant life around us is ultimately what it's all about. The phrase they use is gardening on a higher level.
The Copelands wanted this to be not just a public garden, but a garden that inspires people to go home and think differently about how they take care of their own home landscapes. So gardening on a higher level is all about us trying to inspire people and then motivate them to go home and think about native plants and environmentally beneficial gardening. It's an important thing to figure out whether people are going home and taking the actions that we're hoping to motivate. And so we have to find ways to keep in touch with people after they leave here. We give away something like 10,000 plants a year. We call it or at least I call it, the potato chip marketing approach of, I dare you to plant just one.
We want this to be a garden that makes you reflect a little bit on where we stand in nature, what role we can play in the larger environment. And so we think of Mount Cuba's gardens as being the place where inspiration begins. And inspiration is the first part of our mission. Once you're inspired, once you're engaged with this place, then there's so much more you can do. You can take a class here, you can become a volunteer here, you can go out into your own community and get involved in how the landscape is cared for there, or conservation issues that may be coming up. And that's the trajectory that we would ideally like everyone who comes to Mount Cuba to go on. If you're just here and have a beautiful day, that's okay too.
One walk around this place and it's easy to see that Mother Nature was onto something when she pulled together such a diverse plant palette, one that's on display throughout the eastern United States. But through the years, with a lot of hard work and dedication, the best of the best have been curated right here at Mount Cuba Center, and where all of these native plants on display can provide ideas and inspiration for your own home landscape. And if you'd like to learn more about native plants or Mount Cuba Center, you can do that on our website under the show notes for this episode. The website address, that's the same as our show name. It's growingagreenerworld.com. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm Joe Lample, and we'll see you back here next time for more Growing a Greener World.